I'm welcoming you to this great day for this wonderful tour of Lambert Corner. Our guide is the one and only Bob Russell, who is the Wilton's premier and best and fabulous historian.
Well, my wife's a historian.
Really yes, of course.
Be careful,
but she,
be careful.
yes, be careful. Yes, I'll be careful. They're the dynamic duo.
I invited her to come today, but she said, "Well, Allison's got the books. Allison."
Yeah, I
knows
can
all
carry
about
I can carry Bob's books. It's no problem. But Bob will be talking to us about the history of Lambert Corner, all the various structures here. There's some very interesting stories, and we thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.
I meant to also mention, Jared is filming today. If you don't want to be in his pictures, just kind of step away. We're just using this to record Bob's wonderful knowledge of Wilton and his as he's talking about the building. So we're just catching that kind of an oral history.
And Jared will edit it afterwards to take out all obscene references.
I don't know.
Now we will.
Okay, so I turn it over to Bob Russell. And please, do you want questions afterwards? Or?
No, you can ask me as we go along.
Okay.
I mean, we'll start here because it's nice in the shade, and we'll end up here on the other side of the building because I think there are refreshments in there.
I will check. I'm not sure.
That's your job.
No promises.
Anyhow, we were chatting a while ago about some history related to the Historical Society headquarters. I hope all of you know where that is, just up the road. I'll turn the mic on. We're going to need this. How's that? Yeah, we're going to need this with the trucks going by. So there's quite a bit of history associated with the Betts and Fitch House property, which is also Historical Society, and that's our headquarters, has been for a few years. This was the Historical Society headquarters when the building was first bought by the Historical Society in 1964. But let's go back to the beginning. In the beginning,
Because year she was born.
Oh,
Wait a minute.
can you put that in your book?
that's right, because you were in Jim's high school class.
Yeah?
That's right.
We can't get away with anything here, can we? This is, you're standing in front of a part of the original house. It was built by David Lambert in 1726 or 7. Nobody knows for sure. David Lambert was a well-to-do young man who came from a family in Milford. His father had a lot of money. He had two older sisters who had married men who had settled in Wilton. It was all North Norwalk back then, before 1726, when it became the Wilton Parish, still as part of Norwalk. But the two sisters had married and settled in Wilton, and so when he inherited his father's money in 1722-24, he came to Wilton and started buying land. And he bought this property, built this house in, we think, 1726, got married in 1727, lived here until he died in 1784. So that was almost 60 years. And he started with money. He bought more land. He had 150 acres encompassing land over in that direction, because in the early 1700s there was a lot of land for sale, and anybody with money bought land, just like today, because it was a good investment. You could always sell it and make money. And so David married well, married a cousin, the first cousin actually, had 3 children, a son and 2 daughters. The 2 daughters married men who became very patriotic and served in the Revolution. One married a Gregory, one married a DeForest, old Wilton names, and those were 2 of David's daughters. His son, however, David Jr., was not exactly a patriot. He was much more aligned toward the British. And at the time of the Revolution, David Jr. was more or less voted out of town affairs. They didn't want him meddling because he was likely to, turn people in. In fact, many people in Wilton were either run out of town or arrested during that period because the Patriots and the Loyalists were practically having fist fights with each other. they didn't live together very well because the Patriots felt strongly about getting out from under England's thumb, and the Loyalists felt, you guys are crazy, you're going to get killed if we lose. And so, unfortunately, we were about 2-1 on the Patriot side. And there are stories about Loyalists who did not make out well during the Revolution in Wilton. David Lambert made out all right. He survived. He took his responsibility. This is David Jr. I'm talking about. Took his responsibilities away from him, and then he was more or less repatriated after the war. Now, father was still living, but he wasn't really active during that time. He lived till 1784. David Jr., taking advantage of Daddy's wealth, had gone to Yale. He was the first Wilton person to graduate from college, 1761. He married very well. He married a relative of Governor Fitch, who was the early governor of Connecticut. They had a fantastic wedding in Norwalk. It's been written up and celebrated, and I guess they lived a very royal type life. The Lambert family was interconnected to a lot of other Wilton families. Betts, Gregory, Gilbert, one of those descendants founded Gilbert and Bennett Wire Mill, and a couple others like that. And David Jr. and his wife had 9 children.
Oh, wow.
Some of them did very well and some did not. And they raised in this house. So the original house was this piece in front, and then behind on the north side they added an addition because they had 9 children. So sometime in the late 1700s that first addition was added. The boys, the 4 sons, became businessmen like their father. They were in the business of trading things from mostly with England. We sent goods over there. We bought their goods, brought it over here, and they were merchants that ran a lot of this trade business and continued to make money. Set up their headquarters in New York City. 3 of them, well, I should say, all 4 of them set up in New York City, and the oldest grandson was another David Lambert, and he unfortunately was killed by a mob in New York City in about 1820 something. And so then the other 3 brothers were not as smart business-wise, and they got into trouble. They were borrowing from funds that had been set up for one legal purpose and spending it on another purpose, and so they got caught, and 2 of them went to prison. And by 1827, they gave up the New York business, and all 3 of them moved back here. That's when they built the second wing on the house, the south wing and back. And meanwhile, the 5 daughters, 2 of them married. One married a Belden family member. That didn't work out. He was a brute and a wife beater and a drinker. And so she left him, came back home. Another reason why they added that wing on the house. 3 of the girls had never married. They were in that extra wing on the house. One of the girls did very well. She married a man, a Canadian, who was a very smart businessman. And in the end, his last name was Crookshank. In the end, he kind of bailed out the family when things got tough. So I will not jump ahead to the end of the story just yet, but you're probably all waiting for the Lambert murder, so
Yeah.
well, I might as well do that now. Samuel Lambert, I don't know if you have this picture, Alice. Samuel, this is probably not in the book. This one.
Oh, that one.
Yeah. Samuel was one of the 3 sons that came back to Wilton after the business failed in New York. And he had been unlucky in romance, had been engaged a couple of times, it didn't work out. And so finally at age 65, he married a girl across the street who was the daughter of the groundskeeper for the Lambert family. And they had only one son, David Samuel Rogers Lambert. And this is a picture of young David Samuel Lambert. and his father, who by then was 78, and his mother. And David Samuel Rogers inherited the house, was married, had no children who survived childhood. And so he and his wife were living in this big house. All the rest of the family was gone. And in 1897, he was a teacher. He ran a private school out of this house. So in 1897, two of his former students came back. They were angry because one of them had been severely punished for mistreating one of David's horses. So the two students came back and decided they would rob the house. They knew there was a lot of gold and silver and silverware and gems, valuable things in this old house. And they came in, David wasn't here, his wife was here. She said, "We don't have anything." Well, they didn't believe her, so they gagged her, tied her up, waited for David. He came home, he said the same thing, and they killed him. This is in 1897, December. And it was true, they didn't have anything here because the family had gone on hard times, and the Crookshanks in Canada had bailed them out several times, and a lot of the wealth of the family was in the hands of the Crookshanks. So these two young men got away. Mrs. Lambert, Eva, was an Ogden, another big old family name. The Ogden House, Claire Ogden, all that. She was an Ogden, she was a poet, a very smart lady. And she recognized, even though they had bound her up, she recognized one of the assailants. And so she provided the name. That they hired the Pinkerton detectives. We have that picture.
Yes, we do.
And here's a picture right on this very porch.
Pinkerton detectives.
Recognize the porch?
Yeah.
And the well-dressed men are Pinkerton detectives. The guy in the back is David Lambert's cousin, the farmer, Frank Rockwell, who lived across the street.
The
You
original
can kind of tell the
Lambertons.
farmer from the Pinkertons very easily in that picture. So the Pinkertons took the case. They tracked down the two young men, one in Columbus, Ohio, and the other in Chicago, brought them back here. They both went through trial. They were both condemned to death and hanged. Now,
They were hung in Wilton?
I don't know if it was actually in Wilton, but
I thought it was in New York.
it's a good question. I guess it was New York.
I think it was
Allison's
New York.
researched
No, I
that.
think it was New York.
Okay, but anyhow, they came to the proper end. Now, Frank Rockwell, that nice farmer in the back, well, that's good enough.
That's good enough.
Nobody paid much attention to him, but his grandson became an antiques dealer in New York City and had a lot of very valuable furniture and artifacts. And in about 1985, the Historical Society was notified that they had been left in the will of Rockwell, grandson, whatever his name was, the whole house over in New York State filled with antiques and furniture in 1985. And I think I was part of the team that went over and looked at things. There were a lot of things in that house. And the Historical Society managed to identify a number of things that were really Lambert property. And all this is thank you to Farmer David there. And so they brought back a lot of things and sold the rest of it and got some money out of it. So thank heavens for his grandson who remembered the Wilton Historical Society.
With the Rockwell dining room set in the Fitch House.
Ah, the Rockwell dining room set. Good. Yeah. Now, how did Wilton Historical Society get this house? Well, the Lamberts owned it. One family member, after Eva, David's widow, died, the family in Canada, the Crookshanks, had it for a while, and then they sold it to Ruth, what's her name?
What was her name?
Yeah, Ruth, what's her name?
Sorry, it'll come to us.
neither one of us remember it right now. And a single lady and her brother owned it jointly. And Kellogg.
Kellogg.
Ruth Kellogg. Got it. I know it was back there somewhere. Ruth Kellogg and her brother owned the house in the 1930s and or 1940s, and
This is what the house looked like in circa 1950.
she planted a lot of lilacs.
Lilacs, yeah.
And she called the place Lilacstead.
Right.
Houses had to have names back in those days. And in fact, there's a lilac bush near the entrance to the Betts House, the Historical Society, which is a lineal descendant of the lilacs that are out front. Because we made sure that something was saved from here and moved to the Fitch House and then moved down to the Betts House. So, Historical Society had been founded in 1937, but they didn't, or 38, didn't have a place as a permanent home. And they looked around at several houses in town, and Miss Kellogg offered them the house, but they couldn't afford it. And so I think it was in 1962, the offer was made, and they said, well, we can't afford this. And so they worked out a plan where they would start raising money, and the price was like $75,000 in 1964, which was a whole lot of money, but it's a whole lot of house. I don't even know how many rooms there are. It must be 25 rooms in here. Yeah, very large house. So eventually Historical Society was able to raise the money and close the deal in January of '64. And then, you know, it was first their headquarters, and then about 10 years later, 10 or 12 years later, I should say in 1964, Wilton had passed a historic district ordinance where we could create historic districts. It wouldn't actually prevent anything from happening to the house, but it's a strong deterrent, and that identifies them as historic properties. And we have a number of historic districts in town, and Lambert Commons is one of them. And this was the original house, still is, on this property. Another significant thing that happened was about 10, 12 years later was the adaptive use ordinance, which the town adopted. And that allows you to take a historic property and use it as a modern use without changing the appearance of the house. But you could make a store out of it, for example, which is exactly why we have the Christmas barn here. And we have commercial use in the other properties that are on this land because of the adaptive use ordinance. Thank heavens. Now, while you're looking that direction, those two buildings are both arrived on this property in 1971. Because if you were in Wilton a long time, and I know a number of you grew up here, Route 7, Route 33 used to meet at a perfect Y.
Yeah, little triangle.
A little perfect Y intersection until the state messed it up in 1971 because they thought Super 7 was going to go through here, and so they made this awful turn with the traffic light. It used to merge nicely, and there was a little triangle there, and in the triangle was the house on the left, which was at one time a house for the caretaker of the Lambert property. And then a little farther up on the other side of the road, we have that picture, was the Kent Schoolhouse. It used to sit right on the bottom end of the Orham's property. With the Kent Schoolhouse in its location.
That we have,
There it is.
there it is.
There it is. It's
So,
a cute little one-room
that's the Kent
schoolhouse. Wilton had about 8 of these one-room schoolhouses up until 1930, 1935. Some of them
And
were,
then that's when
yeah.
they just slipped it over onto this property. Pardon my back.
So in connection with the state widening of the road in 1971, they had to get rid of the schoolhouse was in the way, along with some other properties, including the Meyer Mill, if you remember that. That had to be torn down, some lovely old houses along there in order to widen up this part of Route 7. And the state moved this over here. It may have cost us a few bucks, but not a lot. Moved the schoolhouse over here. And at the same time, got the caretaker's cottage. Walt Smith, our wonderful restorer and architect, engineer, contractor, made sure we installed them securely. He moved that little cottage complete with its chimney. The schoolhouse, I think he built the chimney as an outside chimney, which was not what was there originally, but he put a basement under it. Walt was a big believer of basements, so all the buildings that he built had nice basements, storage. And in the front of that little schoolhouse, I'm not sure, it might be open today, maybe we can peek in. There's a circular stairwell that goes down to the basement. Okay, so we can walk around and look at some of the other property. Any more questions about the Lambert?
What year were these two houses built?
71.
Hey, Bob, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead.
When we were kids, we were always told there was some sort of, I think it was a myth, but that there was a underground railroad
Yes,
tunnel
Yeah.
exactly.
at Lilakstad, and we were always told that it was connecting these buildings or
No
something,
way.
but they didn't find it when
No,
they
I mean,
built
I went through
building.
the basement of this building.
You heard that too, though? I mean,
I heard it.
And there, in the
Yeah.
basement, there was kind of an arch headed this direction that didn't go anywhere.
Okay.
And it never did go anywhere as far as we know. Walt Smith investigated it. He had other experts more knowledgeable than I go through the basement and never found any evidence that it was an underground.
It's a myth.
In fact, the Lambert family back in the mid-1700s owned slaves, as a lot of families did in Wilton. It was perfectly legal, and from what I've heard, they treated their slaves fairly and respectfully, but the state of Connecticut started easing out slavery in the late 1700s, and by 1809 it was pretty much gone up north. Of course, we still had it in the south, but so they as far as we know, there was nothing related to the Underground Railroad here.
Okay.
Were the slaves largely domestic servants? Or
Yeah.
they did work the fields?
No, they were largely domestic servants back then.
In the early 1700s, how long did it take to go from Norwalk all the way down to Norwalk Center?
Well, that's part of the reason that Wilton petitioned the colonial legislature to have their own church in 1726, because back then all of New England was congregational, and you had to go to church on Sundays, and you were more or less punished if you didn't. But in Wilton, they had to go clear down into Norwalk, so they petitioned to have their own parish. By 1726, they had 40 families here, and that was enough. And so they built a little tiny church up on Wolf Pit Road, and there's a marker there now that used to sit there until 1971, when the state started messing around with the roads, and we moved it down here behind the Lambert House, and then about 3 years ago we moved it back up there, close to where the church actually stood. We couldn't put it exactly where the little church, which was only there 12 years. And then they built one at Sharp Hill, and then they built the Congregational Church in 1790, where it is now. The little church that was on Wolf Pit was right where the railroad goes under Wolf Pit Road. And the way we know that for sure is when the railroad workers came through in 1851, they started digging up skeletons. And nobody had any record of anything ever being there, but somebody finally said, well, wait a minute, there used to be a church there. And so there was probably a graveyard around the church.
Oh boy.
And so these skeletons laid around a while, and the kids had fun with that. And then finally, finally they buried them, put them in a box and buried them up at Sharp Hill. But that's where the church used to be, right where the railroad goes through. Okay, let's walk around in the other direction.
We'll follow you. We'll follow you.
Okay. So this is a good time to look over in that direction. The little building on the left was moved down here in 1964, shortly after the Historical Society acquired the property. And it used to sit up on Hurlbut Street. It was a general store built in the 1880 time frame. And when I think Bob Carvuto had bought the property and he didn't want it. He offered to move it down to the Historical Society property. And there's a picture in the book, Allison found it, of the house being moved. I think it's probably got Bob Carvuto and Estelle Reimer in the picture. Estelle Reimer was Ed Reimer's mother, longtime resident and president of the Historical Society, and largely the reason that the Historical Society was able to buy the Lambert House.
Can you see that?
I'll go around the
Sure. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. And so it was moved down here, and it's had a number of uses over the years. Right now, Pamela Hovland, who's a designer, has her office in there. And I see Pamela in the market more than I see her here. I don't know when she comes down to the office. And then that nice railroad station was Wilton's first railroad station. It was up, obviously, on the train tracks, about where the current railroad station is. It was built in 1851-52, and it served as Wilton Station until 1940, when they decided, the railroad people decided they needed a new building. And Charles Dana, a wealthy businessman who lived in a little house, the oldest part of which is part of Trackside, the children's. Yes, so that's another part of this. Charles Dana was a very generous man. Made his money on a automotive device, something called the universal joint. We all know what that has to do with transferring movement from one direction to another. And he bought a company that made them like in 1910 and got very wealthy. And he had a retirement place here in Wilton. But he bought the old station and moved it up along the river as a summer house. And sat there for many years. He moved it in 1940, sat there till 1978. And by then the town owned the property. And it was in sad disrepair. The selectmen in 1974 were ready to tear it down. And I got Bob Fazy and Walt Smith interested in this, and I volunteered too, and we did our best to preserve the building and go to selectmen meetings and say, you can't tear this building down. It was Wilton's first train station. The Historical Society is working on a way to preserve it. Phil Dillaway was selectman. He said, we can't preserve it, we're going to tear it down. And so, you know, have a series of pictures like this. We would go up and board up the windows, try to keep the vandals out. The vandals were probably kids in Tierney's class. Probably. But anyhow, we were lucky to save it long enough that, again, Estelle Reimer stepped forward and said the Historical Society will pay for it to be disassembled and moved and rebuilt. And so Walt Smith once again did this. He took it all apart. There are lots of pictures, and probably a whole album of them up there of the thing being disassembled and moved and brought down here and reassembled. Put a nice brick foundation under it. He built a basement. Walt always built basements. The problem is the only access is a set of stairs under the back balcony. And I don't know if anybody's ever gone down there in the last 20 years, but you are. Somebody has to carry stuff up and down the steps. Okay, so there. It's now rented by Andy Forsheimer. After he sold his restaurant business, he wanted an office where he could hang out. And again, I see him other places more than I see him in there, but I guess he pays his rent. And he pays his rent, and he's a great guy. And I wish he'd do something with it because it's a wonderful building. We can go walk around, you can peer in the windows, and you won't see much of anything. Then we're going to go up the hill to see. This was the side that faced the tracks, this side. And they had a passenger room at one end and a baggage room at the other end. So we're looking at what we call the Davenport Barn. It was judge named Judge George Davenport, who lived in the house where Charles Dana lived, which is,
Lover's Lane?
yeah, yeah. It was called Mill Road in the old days. We think we think Tim Merwin gave it the name Lover's Lane. Nobody knows for sure how it got to be Lover's Lane. But, and of course, Trackside is the building there now that's the new addition that I think Allison's husband designed, Rob Sanders designed, added on to the old buildings where Charles Dana had lived. And before Dana, it was George Davenport, a judge. And he had this huge red barn, which sat about where the new part of Trackside sits now. And it was a farmer's barn, obviously. He had farm fields and animals. And after the town had, actually the town had acquired some of the land up there, but the barn itself was still owned by Emery Air Freight. Emery Air Freight got sold out to Consolidated Freightways. They left town. The barn was sitting empty. Walt Smith went to Mr. Cook, I guess, was the resident manager on site for Emery. Not many people were still left at that building. It's now Common Fund, that building. Not many people were left, and Walt went to Mr. Cook and said, "Can you give the barn? You know, Emery could get a tax donation by donating the barn to the Wilton Historical Society." Oh, and suddenly people get interested when you mention things like that. And so I know I was part of the team that went up there, and we took out some wonderful tools, carpenter benches, things that are now on display at the Historical Society. And then we got an angry call from Mr. Cook who said, "We didn't give the Historical Society permission to do this." And it turns out he had offered it to Walt Smith, not to the Historical Society. So we had to put it all back. And then he gave it to Walt Smith. And Walt turned around and gave it to the Historical Society. We've had a number of things like that. We got one way or another. So that was a real project. A big barn had to be disassembled and moved. And Rob Sanders, Allison, your husband, was in on this.
Yep.
A great deal. On disassembling the barn, moving it down here, reassembling it. You'll notice it has a nice basement. Everything down here has a nice basement. And we won't go in the basement, but we can go in on the first floor because Allison has a key. It's a beautiful building. So it's rented to a little organization called the Circle of Care that helps families with cancer patients, children primarily. So let's walk up the hill. Of course, the barn used to have the sliding white doors, but that doesn't meet the town code, so they had to be permanently fixed in an open position. So you can see what a gorgeous barn this is. There's two lofts which were hay lofts in the old days. And I'm sure there was a pulley system and a hoist that went to an outside trapdoor so you could raise the hay up into the attic, up into the hay lofts. All the original beams, just a gorgeous building. Dates from about 1850. And so it was carefully disassembled and reassembled, and here it is. I talked to Tom Sheridan, who has the Cannon store. He said, Circle of Care beat me to it. He said, I really wanted that building for my business, but they got here first. So.
That looks like the pulley system, or at least a hanging over there.
Yeah.
Mr. Russell, the roof is new, it looks like. So how do they go about making that decision to change the roof? I mean,
Well,
everything is a wood roof
We
structure,
have a
so.
building and grounds committee at the Historical Society, and they're always looking at roofs. She said the roof looks new, Allison.
Yes, we had the roof redone last summer. It was leaking. We had they were getting damage. You can't.
Yeah, yeah. That's
Landlords.
Oh yeah.
it's a thing about old buildings. There's always something that has to be done. Roof doesn't look too great on the Cannon store either. Oh, it's the,
That's not the next one though.
No,
The
that
next
looks
one is
good.
the Abbott Barn.
okay, okay.
I have a whole
Oh.
list.
There's still 20 years in there.
I do.
Attorney said there's 20 years left on that one. I don't know. But incidentally, or coincidentally, that building became available to us in 1990 also. So they started moving this down from Cannondale, and they were still building the structure for the barn because we have some old pictures during the construction process. So they were both going on in 1990. Now Tom Sheridan, who has an interior decorating business, has had one in Wilton for 40 years, probably longer. I know it's longer. Is the current tenant, and he was most recently up near Sharp Hill Road on the right, an old white house and a barn in back, and he downsized to here. That property's been sold. It's one of the ones Allison mentioned that's endangered, where Tom used to be. I said, I remember John Bronk used to live in that house. He said, I bought that one from John Bronk. So, and then he said, you may not remember, he said, but I was the first tenant in the railroad station after the Historical Society renovated it in 1978. Well, I didn't remember, but Sheridan did. And he said, I was there 2 years, and I wanted more space, so I was then moved over to the front of the Lambert House
Oh.
for 6 years. Because I remember, that's where I met Tom. He was running his business out of the Lambert House, where the Christmas barn is now. And again, it's a beautiful space, but then I guess he bought the one up the road. I didn't ask him if we could go in today, but you can go peek in the back. This is the main entrance in the back. This is a store that was in Cannondale. A man named John Cannon, the first cannon in Cannondale, built this store about 1790, and was the only one in Cannondale for quite a while. And then the property ended up in the hands of Trigby and Muriel Hansen. And some of you may remember or may know Trigby Hansen. He's our Normandy D-Day man. He was over there last week for the 75th anniversary of the Normandy landing. He was Norwegian. He still is Norwegian, but he was on the Norwegian ship that was offshore at Normandy supporting the landing of the troops. And I said, how many people were on that ship? Well, 150. How many of them are left? He said, I'm in. He's 97. But he moves around pretty well. Oh yeah, I know. I see him at the village luncheonette a couple days a week. In fact, I'm expecting him to show up tomorrow if he isn't exhausted from his trip. But he and Muriel owned that property up there, and this wonderful old store building was there in disuse. And so, you know, I guess Walt Smith used his persuasion powers. You get a tax donation if you give it to the Historical Society. They said, okay. And so Walt moved it. He had to take the roof off, but he moved it intact down Danbury Road from Cannondale in 1990. The latest picture of it might be in Allison's book. It was in a field up in Cannondale, the store. But originally it used to sit in a more prominent location, like near the triangle. It used to be a triangle where Cannon Road comes out onto Route 7. And Walt thought that originally it probably was up right near Danbury Road.
It doesn't show the setting so much.
Does it have a
but-
picture of Trigby and Muriel? Yeah.
Yes, and there's the third picture.
Yeah.
Now that you bring it up.
I asked Trigby if he was going to travel alone. No, he said, my son's going to go with me. And he said they're going to pay for him too, because he got a sponsor to pay for this whole trip. And he said, by the way, my travel agent who lives in Greenwich is going to go with me too. And you have to pay for him too. So, okay, we can look in the window here and then just keep going around the building. As I said, he's an interior decorator, and so he has a little sitting area there where he shows his samples to people, and then he has lots of books full of samples. He has rugs and things in the basement. Walt Smith always puts a basement in when he moves a building, and his office is upstairs. And it's really a lovely building. It looks very 1890-ish, I mean 1790-ish. Yeah, they apparently left the lights on. I told him we were going to come by today, so I think he left the lights on.
It's a nice basement.
Yeah, nice basement. So this corn crib came from the same place. It was the Cannon family corn crib because they had quite a bit of farmland up there. Walt says this is one of the earlier corn cribs. His estimate, it was built in the late 1700s.
Wow.
And again, they moved it intact. He said it was a two-room deal. The front room was where they processed the corn, and the back was where they stored it. It had ventilation, as corn cribs had to have. Oh, that's that.
Not yet.
The privy. We'll see more of that later.
Were these originally the screen color or were they red?
They were red when he moved them. I don't know what color they were in 1790. Nobody took pictures then.
What is it about this shape where it comes down and it's narrower at the bottom?
It's kind of keep some of the rain out.
Oh, okay.
It's a traditional corn crib storage building shape.
Uh-huh.
People always want to know what was in that notch there where the sumac trees are growing. And we think maybe a silo, although we don't know for sure. And then there's another bigger notch down here by this big tree. And that we're pretty sure was an outhouse. In the book that Allison has, there's a picture of what used to be in there. Was too far gone to save. And so we had to take it down. I'll wait till Allison gets here. You have a picture of the outhouse that used to be over here.
Yes, of course. Let's see.
That's it.
There we go.
Quite large. It's like a little store.
Yeah, it was a. Well, they had a large family. And I don't know how old it was, but it
Yeah,
was.
but it's Greek Revival,
Oh, okay. It was too
1830.
far gone to save, I think, was the judgment on that one. Oh, since we couldn't save the original outhouse, Walt says every little community has to have an outhouse. So he found this one up on the Davenport property, again where Charles Dana lived. Over at the far left was this wonderful little outhouse. And so they gave that to the Historical Society. You can open the front door. Open the front door.
Is it functioning?
Nobody's tried it lately. It's a 3-holer though.
There's no waiting.
Yeah.
Exactly. I'm sorry. Solo.
Mr. Russell, yesterday they had an ABC house tour, and they had a Dudley Road property, which I thought was where one of the Lambert murder you were mentioning. Did you talk about that earlier and I missed it?
Oh, you missed the Lambert murder?
No, I heard your conversation here, but
The big murder was in this house. It was on the porch where we had assembled first. Did you get? They were still on the porch.
Yes, I heard that portion.
Yeah, that was the murder inside that door.
Oh, that's
from
where
that
it had
porch.
happened.
Yeah, in 1897, these two former students of David, who had a private school here, came back thinking they would find a lot of silver and money, and there wasn't any of that. It was gone. The family was poor. They'd given anything of any value to the cousins up in Canada. So that's where the murder was. But they owned a lot of property over there, where number 10, number 20, Westport Road on. That was their property. Okay, did we close up the outhouse? Oh. Yeah, grab the door. We don't want anybody using it. Heaven forbid. But that sounds.
That's like fine, 'cause
Oh, that sounds good.
there's a little gap.
Yeah.
Nobody's really breaking
Let's see. Couple other things I should point out about the back of the Lambert House. I told you a while ago this wing on the south side was added first. The wing on the north side was added after, I think it was the opposite. The wing on the north side was added first. The wing on the south came a little later because all the family members kept moving back here. And then after Miss Kellogg bought it, she added the garage, which as you can see is filled with stuff. What's in there, Allison? In the garage.
I have no idea.
There's a lot of stuff missing from the Lambert house, and a lot of it might be in here, but who knows?
Really?
I'm sorry, not Lambert. I mean Ambler Farm. Ambler Farm stuff might be in here.
All right. I'll look into that.
Yeah. So Miss Kellogg added that later on, and upgraded the heating system. She put in a new furnace and a new electrical system when she moved here. I've been down in the basement. You probably have too. Yeah, and it's very interesting. Very interesting down there. The base of that
Old basement.
main chimney is about 20 feet square. It's an enormous chimney. And the original 1726 house, of course, didn't have that little gambrel type adjustment on it. We don't know who added that or when, but it made much more space on the third floor. So the third floor is rented, the second floor is rented, first floor is the Christmas barn, and I think you've probably rented all the space, right, Allison?
It's all rented. Yeah.
Great.
But I mean, people have offices up there?
The apartment.
There's two,
Apartments.
there's
Those
two
are apartments.
residential
I didn't know that.
apartments and one office space.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, well that's pretty much it. We can go in and see if there's any snacks inside the Christmas barn.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you.